So, hello again, and welcome to another chapter of child development. We're going to talk today about social development with children, as in chapter 11 in your textbook. One of the things that I do want to I'm looking at my notes here, is that I wanted to point out is that if you think about different types of social and emotional issues, um, that go on through childhood and into adolescence, and really kind of what that means, especially with children who really have struggled a lot. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. With negotiating these kinds of skills. And so I think that it'll be able to give you some background in terms of context, especially when you listen to some of the other guest faculty lectures in the series this semester. So when we look at chapter 11, I want you to think about it, the concept that Piaget put forward. And this was, very early on in the last century. In the children's relationships with adults are qualitatively different from their relationships with other children. He puts out to the sense that there's a vertical dimension, right? The line of power from child to adult goes from child upward. And that's a line of power. Children's relationships with others tend to be structured on very much more of a horizontal plane, or a much more equal. And especially when we talk about development of relationships, when there's a more equal plane, then children can explore conflicting ideas and learn to compromise in a very different way than how they negotiate that vertical dimension with adults. So think of it in terms of children and play too, and which is why we look at very much developmentally in preschool, and although less so now in kindergarten, what it means for kids to interact with other kids. Sullivan in the 50s really talked about children's relationships helped shape personalities, and later relationships, how later relationships they form in adolescence. So there is a piece of that theoretical construct that really argues for the importance of kids in early relationships. There's some theories that talk about the biological and evolutionary basis of behavior, as well as social learning theorists. And the book really goes into a lot more detail that you should be paying attention to. Group socialization theory views children in learning from groups from their peers. And again, that very much goes back to the concept that Piaget put out in the early 30s. Didn't mean to make you dizzy there, sorry. So group socialization theory stresses that children's interactions with a larger peer culture are very much the primary socialization agents for their development, which is again this function of play. And even as early as the 30s, Parton observed what he felt were 6 different types of play that preschoolers engage in, right, from the most to the least complex, beginning with cooperative and going down to solitary play. It's important that we look at how we structure activities for children in terms of this kind of complexity, because cooperative play, it's extraordinarily important for kids to construct that, because it creates situations where they can pretend, they can do construction, they can work together. It has to do with formal types of games, etc. And that, again, when we look at social and emotional development, that very much has to do with worldview, how we relate to each other, where our cognitive development and how we go forward with that. So again, function of play is extraordinarily important when you look at child development. And there are different kinds of play, right? Physical play, body movements, and they're done because it's enjoyable. It's enjoyable to be physical. Rough and tumble play, chasing and laughing with each other, playing with objects, learning the purpose of objects, what things do, building, dropping things, making noises, etc. Pretend play is something that incorporates things and objects that become representational of other things. And again, these types of play each have their own appropriate place in terms of our cognitive, social, and emotional development. And it's very interesting to look at when our children are not involved in these various types of things. There are challenges that come forward because of that, and also because of where kids are in their cognitive development, what's appropriate and what's not for them to be able to play with. So when we look at peer interaction, right, at birth, infants are not aware of other infants per se. They will gaze at one another at around 2 months. As they get older, they take interest in other infants. And at 9 months, there's clearly this development towards interest in peers. At about 1, you start to see some consolidation of several behaviors. In other words, remember we talked about in last chapter in terms of emotional displays, that they display smiles and frowns in a rudimentary kind of way. And these kinds of things are going to be limited by the cognitive, motoric, and linguistic capacities of children. So you can see that there are implications for our children who develop differently than others in terms of how these kinds of social engagement go forward. So as kids get older, so preschool, right, 2 to 5 years, you see new kinds of social interactions made possible because of locomotion, right? The ability to crawl, walk, run. And that also has implications in terms of our developing cognitive as well as linguistic skills. Social interactions become more complex and more reciprocal and intricate over sustained periods of time at this time than they are in infancy. Toddlers start showing an understanding of what it means to take turns and what kind of coordination it takes in their play to be with another, with a partner to play with. Pretend play starts to emerge somewhere around 2, but somewhere more in 3. Again, it's cognition and that development that allows children to take objects or create situations that are not representative of what is their fantasy or pretend play. And theory of mind develops. So we have a sort of a dominancy hierarchies in kids from 2 to 5, plays a dominant role in groups, begins to develop around this age too. As we go into elementary school, somewhere, again, right now we're talking about peer interaction between the age of 6 and 12. Social interaction really takes off and it rises. So kids spend about 30% of their time with their peers. And children's peer groups become larger and more diverse, obviously because of their introduction into school those types of groups, the number of children that they are actually associate with during this time in their lives. And groups tend to be like less supervised, which again goes with their cognitive and emotional and social development, for them to take on much more of an autonomous type of role and not rely as much on their adult in the room. We see verbal aggression becoming a bit more prominent, and play takes the form of games with rules. Again, social dominance in the hierarchy of social orders within groups of children become more stable. And children are able to agree which children in a group are actually play the dominant role at this point in time. So from adolescence into teen, family relationships start to be restructured. Again, teens going forward spend less time within their family structure and much more with peers. And the peer relationships become much more intense, and the numbers multiply. Overall, the number of friends tends to decrease, but the intensity is actually increased. So friendships take on much more of a different significance and center much more on intimacy or self-disclosure. Social life is organized in cliques. You see that in high school a lot. Some close-knit groups of friends are usually same-sex. Crowds of friends usually tend to be wider, much more opposite kind of sex cliques. So some of the determinants of how peers accept one another include names, an important factor in kids' judgments upon each other, according to research. Physical attractiveness is seen as important, much more than girls than boys. In our current and cultural place here in the 21st century, children generally play with same-sex partners somewhere around after 7 years old. In Western culture, children tend to be much more same-aged, play together. In other cultures, children tend to play with much younger children than themselves. It's an interesting cultural context that we need to take into account. When we look at different types of criteria, Rubin and Copeland really looked at 5 categories and used these categories to look how children look at how they integrate peers, right, into their social cliques, social orders. There are the popular kids. Kids tend to rate things on a dimension of like, most liked versus least liked. They looked at controversial, again, how kids rate each other as most liked, least liked. Neglected. The children who score low are considered neglected, right, in this order of social metrics. Children who are rejected, they may be aggressively rejected, high number of behavioral problems with interactions, or non-aggressive rejection, which is socially, maybe they're unskilled, they tend to be withdrawn, they're socially anxious. So you look at this where peers are ranked, and Copeland had popular, controversial, neglected, average, kids who fit in the middle, and those who are rejected. Children who are rejected by their peers are much more likely to be lonely and have school difficulties than those who are accepted. There is a friendship process, interestingly enough, and it's defined as the relationship between equals and the reciprocity that it takes in the commitment to one another to be labeled as friend. So there's the research is very interesting on this, and Parker and Gottman focused on friendship changes based on age sort of range. So at 3 to 7 years, the goal of interactions is to successfully be able to have coordinated play with one another. That's kind of what friends are about. As children get older, somewhere between the ages of 8 and 12, the goal is really about peer acceptance. And somewhere around 13, the goal of friendship changes, partly because of the developmental process in which a child tween going into teenagehood begins to develop a better understanding of self. And with adolescent friendships, there's an increased focus on self-disclosure. In other words, talking about yourself and who you are. Another researcher found evidence that there are 3 levels of friendship. And again, if you look at this particular slide, it has to do with somewhere around age and where kids are developmentally. If you go back to the previous slide, the Parker and Gottman, they suggest friendships are really kind of at the heart of our social and emotional competence as becoming developing adults. A really important concept that really has come into play, and your book's author talks about this concept as being defined as the ability to infer the existence of mental states of others and yourself and use them as explanatory devices to look at human behavior. That's saying theory of mind is really related to social cognitive development. It's how we think about social interactions. So with a young child, they come to their own understanding that their own beliefs and desires and their ability to pretend, and that others have this belief system desires that are different from their own. All right. One of the things that you may find interesting is that there's a criticism within this concept of false belief tasks, and that perhaps the tasks are too complex for young children to really understand. And so kids as young as 15 may understand false belief. And this concept that's talked about in the book in depth really is something that not every researcher has really bought into. But as we develop our sense of self, it's often said to occur sometime around 18 to 24 months, so around 2 years. And it can be sort of tested with this Rouge test, this self-awareness, right? So what the experimenter does is marks the face of an infant with some rouge in such a way that the child is unaware that it's done. Then the child is placed in front of a mirror. and the behaviors observed. So if the infant moves towards to explore or remove that dot, looking in a mirror, they're credited with having a sense of self by recognizing their face looks different than before the mark was put on. So that's how we look at research in very young children on this sense of self. One very important aspect of our development is this role of perspective or role taking. And Selman proposed a 5-stage model about being able to go forward with the development of this role taking ability. And in the book, he describes how the child learns to differentiate between their self and the other perspective. So this is a bit of a synopsis in terms of his model. At stage 0, infant or child cannot distinguish between their perspective and that of others. Stage 1, the child recognizes that they and others may have a different perspective, but has difficulty describing what that other perspective might be. At stage 2, the child will see themselves from another perspective and know that others have a similar capacity to be able to do that. The third stage is when a child recognizes how a third person might view the perspective and the other's situation. And the fourth is when we have this much more intricate network of perspectives that bind individuals into a social system. So this task of understanding how children get to evolve in a highly social environment is important for their own overall well-being. Social development is really strongly connected and linked to changes in our cognitive development. And the development of friendships and peer relationships are extraordinarily relevant to other areas that we study, such as developmental psychopathology and emotional development. So how children do not develop or develop differently within this kind of a structure. So on that note, I will let you go. Have a great week, or whatever's left of it, depending on where you are in your week. And I will talk to you again soon.